James Joyce's Ulysses was widely regarded as one of the most complicated novels in the history of literature, or in the history of Western literature. Some people hated it, some people loved it, and famously, Virginia Woolf, after reading 200 pages of the book, deemed it as one of the most boring books she'd ever read. So when a moment comes when you do decide to tackle this piece of work, there are a lot of conflicting opinions out there. But in this video of Booknotes, episode number 2 on James Joyce's Ulysses, I simply just want to share with you guys some of my own research and some of my own perspectives on this book. First of all, if you know anything about James Joyce, principally, he was famous for using a shit ton of languages in one book. If you want to tackle Ulysses, there's a lot of Latin in there, and there's a lot of French in there, and in certain places there are entire paragraphs of Italian. So before we dive into modernist history and before I take a deep dive into James Joyce's work, here's a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Babbel. For a recent video I did on my own French learning journey, I talked about Babbel Live, but this time, Babbel is offering the rest of you guys another opportunity to start learning another language. The language of my choice is French, and actually before Babbel actually reached out to me about a year and a half ago, I started learning French simply with Babbel and nothing else. The university classes were boring me to death, and I was simply looking for another way to practice the language in a more engaging fashion. And right now, after a year and a half on Babbel of studying French, je peux lire la littérature française. I could read French literature, namely Albert Camus' The Stranger, and I'm able to communicate fluently to a conversational extent with native speakers. Babbel features very short classes and very fun daily practices that's going to cater to your language learning level. They have beginner classes for the absolute beginners, and if you want to spice up your French a little bit, you could choose one of their advanced courses. So if you want to be a polyglot, if you just want to be a little more like James Joyce, speaking 20-something languages, be sure to click the link in the description down below right now to receive a discount on your first subscription to Babbel. It is an excellent app for taking you out of that entire grammar drilling environment at universities or in one of your high school classes. For me, it really was an app that completely changed how I looked at language learning. And for now, let's dive back into James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, I personally think, before even getting to the novel, it's very important for us to understand the historical context behind this novel. Why was it so special? Why was it so stylistically different from so many novels that came before Ulysses? And for that, we have to talk about the concept of modernity. What does it mean to be modern? And where exactly is the fault line between modern history and history that came before modern history? As French philosopher and literary critic Alain Badiou argued in his paper Search for a Method, he never failed to thought these years of modernity represent a period of exceptional invention marked by a polymorphous creativity that can only be compared to the Florentine Renaissance. All kinds of innovation were springing to life in fields of psychology, in fields of science, and in fields of course, literature. Under the discourse of innovation, literature took on a new objective. Literature took on kind of a new spin and a new artistic standard, which is heavily influenced by the modernist movement across the globe. As Belgian philosopher Thierry de Duve argued, innovation as a part of modernity is far from being a mere epiphenomenon. The notion of artistic quality, which previously had been linked to technical mastery, to talent, and to relatively unchanging notions of style, now finds itself irrevocably connected to the notion of innovation. And this kind of stylistic innovation wasn't just present in Joyce's writings alone. It was also very much present in Virginia Woolf's writings, very much present in Ezra Pound's poems, the Cantos, or for example T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. This obsession with creating something new eventually found its way into other things outside of literature, principally cubism in paintings, futurism in politics, and also with various forms of avant-garde performative theater. But with that being said, there's also a danger for us to overgeneralize the motivations of an artist. For example, James Joyce. It is true that he was a part of this modernist literary movement, and it's also true that his work could be compared to the likes of Virginia Woolf, to the likes of T.S. Eliot, and to the likes of all the other modernist writers. Each and every single one of these writers, Gertrude Stein, Hemingway, despite the fact that they kind of existed in the same time period, they all had their own motivations for producing their pieces of literary works. And for James Joyce, his rationale for writing Ulysses was very much grounded in his cultural heritage as an Irishman, alongside his very complicated relationship with his hometown, Dublin. In a brilliantly written paper, James Joyce, The Irishman by Seamus Dean, the motivation and the intention behind the writing of Ulysses was thoroughly examined and unpacked. And the first motive for writing Ulysses, in this case, came from a kind of linguistic anxiety, as Dean would put it. By the time James Joyce was born, Ireland was in a sense under British rule and under British governance. And with the rise of imperialism, some parts of this cultural heritage is lost. Not many people speak Irish anymore, not many people know the rich cultural history anymore. And as Dean articulated in the paper, Joyce's own career as a writer is dominated by the same linguistic anxieties. He could write a spiritual history of his own country, but only when he found that mode of English appropriate to Irish experience, through which the Irish could repossess their experience in an English which was unmistakably an Irish English. A part of this entire exercise of creating a new mode of writing in Ulysses, or rather a more obscure form of writing, is to recreate or to reclaim that sense of Irishness, is to reconnect with a sense of cultural heritage that was lost due to imperialism and due to British rule. And the construction of events in Ulysses of one single day in Dublin as a parallel to Homer's Odyssey was articulated as a form of translation. Joyce and his contemporaries wore the linguistic root with a difference. Their language did not represent an identifiable world beyond itself. It represented the ways in which the idea of Ireland represented the reality of Ireland. It was, in effect, an exercise in translation. This is a very crucial point, because so often when we write about our home cities, for me it's Melbourne, there's this instinctive sense to romanticize the place, or to write the place as a place that's, something that's other than itself. But James Joyce, through adhering to the town, through adhering to all the baggages, the cultural baggages, the linguistic baggages, and all the slangs on the streets, through adhering to that very closely, he created a kind of looking glass that very much clearly portrayed the conditions of people off the streets, people in the pubs, of Dublin. And after Ulysses was published, it went through a few obscenity trials because apparently people think James Joyce is being too harsh and too direct and too clear with some of his portrayals of Dublin in 1904. But Joyce defended himself by saying, "I seriously believe that you'll retard the course of civilization in Ireland by preventing the Irish people from having one good look at themselves in my nicely polished looking glass." So in a sense, Joyce is a painter with words who was very much concerned with delivering something that's 100% true, delivering something that's as close as you could get to an actual experience of an actual day in Dublin. And now you might be wondering, if it's just one day in Dublin, why are there so many allusions to history, to ancient Greek mythology, to everything out there that we just don't understand? That's a great point, and that comes back to the cultural heritage of being an Irishman. Dublin, in James Joyce's eyes, or at least the city in his eyes, was a city that inhabited three spheres of civilization. The first was that of the British Empire, the second that of Roman Catholicism, the third that of the ancient Europe, which Ireland had made such an important contribution. To be truly European, the art would have to represent the city as inheritor of the Judeo-Greek civilization in a language which would be as diversified and varied as the city's dense and intricate past. And this effort on Joyce's part to bring together these three spheres into one city, into one book, into one entire collection of stories, well, that's going to require some different kinds of language. And to portray Dublin under this so-called Irish tongue was to recognize that Dublin was a strange mix of the oral and the literate cultures. It prided itself on its reputation for wit, good conversation, malicious gossip, oratory, drama, and journalism. Joyce's work reflects this aspect of the city's culture. Its mosaic set pieces, sermons, speeches, stories, witticisms, rhetorical extravaganzas, and mimicries. And if you bring all of those facts together, the history, the ways of writing, and this obsession with innovation, with modernism, well, that's basically Ulysses for you. Ulysses, for me at least, is a treasure trove of history, and it's a treasure trove of Irish cultural heritage. And to be sympathetic and to understand another culture, to read Ulysses, is to lend the Irish culture and its past a listening ear. And just to give you a small example, here's one of my favorite passages. Trends pass one another, ingoing, outgoing, clanging, useless words. Things go on same day after day. Squads of police marching out, back, tramps in, out. Those two loonies mooching about. Dinam carted off. Me and a pure foy, swollen belly on a bed groaning to have a child tucked out of her. One born every second somewhere, other dying every second, since I fed the birds 5 minutes. And that little paragraph right there was simply a little piece of observation from the story's protagonist, Leopold Bloom. And if you want to read this book, the majority of this book was told from his perspective, so have fun with that. So, if you're still here, if my history lesson didn't bore you to death, how do we tackle Ulysses, actually? Well, with a very firm understanding of what Joyce was trying to do with his book, of what Joyce was trying to portray Dublin as, it gets rather easy for us to conjure up a way to deal with Ulysses. The reason why a lot of people couldn't finish it, the reason why a lot of people are afraid of the book, is because they simply have the wrong attitude when they're reading this book. If it's a book about celebrating Irish culture, celebrating Irish witticisms and its very messy life, the very messy lives of people living in Dublin in 1904, why are we then so concerned with little allusions and little, traces of history and traces of stuff that we potentially don't understand? For me, at least, personally, reading Ulysses was a portal for me to enter a different world. A portal for me to have the same experience of landing in a foreign country. It's putting me in the position of being an absolute dumbass for a while. It's putting me in a position to completely open myself up to alternative experiences, which to me is what an education is for. And the purpose of fiction, and also, together with Ulysses, is to subconsciously transform you. It's not a very explicit kind of understanding that you're after when you're reading something like Ulysses, but it is a kind of internal transformation, an internal kind of consciousness change that you're really seeking. That's why when I see people taking this book way too seriously, decoding every allusion and declaring it as, a masterpiece of 20th century literature, I couldn't help but to laugh, because they're missing out a point of the book completely. There were a few rough chapters at the start, but once I got into the rhythm of reading this book without worrying too much about allusions and without worrying too much about, understanding everything, I actually really enjoyed where the story was going. Each chapter had a different flavor, each chapter had a different intention, and each chapter had a different funny story or a funny scene. And it is viewing this book as a performance that really allowed me to keep going with it and to eventually finish it. And in fact, my professor, during one of the lectures, actually said to us, just have fun with Ulysses. Just have a lot of fun with Ulysses and, embrace the confusion. Embrace everything that you perhaps will never understand because there's simply too much in there. And realize that at the end of the novel, upon closing the last page of the novel, well, that was entirely a big practical joke on you if you took it too seriously. So in conclusion, if you really want to enjoy Ulysses without getting bogged down by all the illusions, just strap in, crack in, and just flow with the experiences and just flow with the sceneries, flow with your own confusion, laugh at your own confusion, and laugh at whatever's funny in this book, because this book right here is probably one of the funniest books I've ever read. And a bonus tip is to put on an audiobook in the background as you are reading this piece of work, because some parts of this book could be very dense, and with an audiobook in the background, it sort of like simulates that effect of you passing through the streets of Dublin, or you eavesdropping on different conversations. It's really quite a magical feeling, at least for me. And that concludes this video on James Joyce's Ulysses. If you want to read this book, be sure to pick up a copy right now from your local bookstore and just strap in, get started, and leave me your comments down below. Did you finish James Joyce's Ulysses? And maybe after watching this video, would you like to start all over again? What lessons have you learned from reading this book? And of course, R.C. Waldun here. Thank you for watching, and I would see you in the next one.